Welcome to the Biblical Leadership at Work podcast. I'm your host, Jason Woodard. Before I introduce this month's guest, I want to share with you that this podcast marks our 1-year anniversary and the end of our first season. I am so grateful that the Lord has used this medium to be a conduit of blessing to many others. It has been a great joy and privilege to meet so many other leaders working to honor Christ in the fields they are called to. I hope and pray you will stick with us for season 2 as we continue to meet new guests and spend some time focusing on some specific leadership topics with some of my favorite leaders. Now, on to the main reason you came here today. Today, we will meet Peggy Bodde, wife, mother, seasoned executive leader, and an entrepreneur who works to help other women strive in the marketplace and honor Christ in the process. Listen in as we learn about how God rescued her from an abusive childhood and later sustained her through the challenges of being a single mom.
I was adopted as a baby into an abusive home where we went to church regularly. Both parents were very involved in church. The house was spotless. So from the outside looking in, we were an ideal family. But on the inside, it was more like a war zone.
Peggy spent over 20 years in leadership roles in operations and supply chain before the Lord allowed a devastating career event to change her course of direction.
What finally happened is I was up for kind of the pinnacle promotion of CEO, and right before my interview, I had to have emergency surgery on my spine. And while I was in the hospital, my boss interviewed and hired the other candidate. And that was really painful. But God taught me that, I had put my career on the throne. He had given me that career to provide stability for me and my daughter, and I had made it an idol. So it was humiliating, but I needed that.
We will hear how God directed her into a new career path where for the past 8 years, she has built an organization of helping others to excel in the marketplace for God's glory. Today, you'll also hear about Peggy's 3 leadership principles, which I absolutely love and think she could write a book about.
Show excellence is the first one. And the second one is to broker hope. The pandemic is a great example. As Christian leaders, I think we have a lot of opportunities to steer people through difficult situations in a way that inspires hope. And I think that's really important. And the last one is to love fully.
And we'll hear her give some great advice for both new and seasoned leaders.
I always tell new leaders, address conflict head on. It's going to be something that you're going to deal with inevitably, but the longer a situation is unaddressed, the bigger it's going to grow.
So now let's meet Peggy Bodde. All right, Peggy Bodde, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to get to know you and have our audience hear about what God has done in your life and is doing in your life.
Jason.
So welcome.
I am a fan of your podcast, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. Good to hear that. Let's start off by talking about your educational and career background. I know God's led you through a couple of big career changes, which will be exciting to hear about. So let's start there, learn a little bit about that.
You are right. God has led me on a lot of career changes. I have to say my professional journey looks a lot like the verse in Proverbs 16 that humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. So
Amen.
I started working at McDonald's when I was 15, and I mentioned that because I worked there through college, and it was one of those jobs that I thought was a stepping stone. I had no idea that God was using that experience to give me the background I needed for a lifelong career in leadership and management. So I became a manager at McDonald's when I was still a teenager. And I learned a lot about managing people in business during that time. And I stayed there for 7 years until I graduated with a degree in English. And then I went on to teach high school English and Spanish. And I applied and was accepted to law school. And the summer before I went to law school, everything changed. So I took a seasonal job as the receptionist. I was only supposed to be there for the summer, and the company was a small manufacturing company called Pigeon Mountain Industries. Because it was a small company, I was able to do projects for different departments and basically learn the business. So one day, my boss, who was also my first business mentor, calls me in and he says, you have a knack for business. I really think you should hold off on law school and take a few MBA classes and stick around. So that was a total God moment because my whole path I charted out and planned. I was accepted to law school. I was going. But God took my boss, who was not a believer, but he was a great mentor, and used him to change the course of my career. And at that time, I was a single mom. And I know in hindsight that going to law school in a big city with no support would not have been a good situation for me or my daughter.
How old about were you at that time when he came and talked to you?
Let's see. I was 24. I was 24.
Okay. I think that's just a really good reminder for those of us who are probably, closer to his age now, right? You and I are further along in our career, but the impact we can have on those younger people that we work with. I mean, we have insight and see things in their talent and their abilities that they probably don't see yet and can help them and mentor them.
It is powerful.
It's pretty powerful.
It is powerful because he was mindful and he spoke into my life, into my career, and that pivoted everything that, so yeah, I love that point that we can take that mindfulness and use it to help move someone along.
So, okay. So then what?
Well, Pigeon Mountain Industries, the small company, was also the North American distribution arm for a larger French company called Petzl. So over the next 5 years, we grew exponentially. And then another change happened because my boss and the president of Petzl reached an impasse. And I think the core reason behind that was my boss was an entrepreneur at heart. So entrepreneurship was his passion, and he wanted to keep a certain level of independence that the Petzl Foundation wasn't really comfortable with. And I think that's classic.
Yep, it is. I've been through it.
So the two companies split, and every single employee was given the opportunity to stay with Pigeon Mountain Industries in North Georgia or go out west with Petzl. So I talked to my boss, and this time he encouraged me to go. He said, I want you to have opportunities that Petzl can provide that I will never be able to provide. So again, he wasn't a believer, but he always put people first, and that created another change in my life. So off I went.
That's huge. Yeah, that's good. So then did you have to move from there?
Yes.
Relocate?
So one of my first responsibilities for Petzl was to establish their Western office in Utah in the Salt Lake City area. So daughter and I picked up and moved. I have to say that Petzl provided a great safety net. So I didn't have to worry about expenses or finding a house or, they wanted me to be able to concentrate on relocating employees, setting up the distribution center. So they took care of the financial aspect, which made it a lot easier to make that move.
Yeah, for sure.
So that became a huge adventure in my life. And I ended up staying with Petzl for about 20 years. And as the company grew and became more organized, I settled into my niche, which was supply chain. I just loved developing teams and systems and working behind the scenes. All my direct reports were managers of departments or programs. So that gave me the opportunity to develop new leaders, which that was a passion of mine. And when I resigned from there, I was the vice president of supply chain. And God once again moved me into a completely different career, which was scary. I went from corporate leadership to starting a freelance writing business.
Big step. I'm interested in hearing about that. As I've gotten to know you and read your background and your biography, that's a big change.
Yeah, it was huge. And God had been prompting me. My degree was in English. I had never stopped writing despite my corporate career. In fact, I was kind of the resident scribe, no matter what my job title was. So he'd been prompting me to make the change for a long time. And I was fearful. My identity was kind of locked into my leadership position. I had a great income. So what finally happened is I was up for kind of the pinnacle promotion of CEO. And right before my interview, I had to have emergency surgery on my spine. And while I was in the hospital, my boss interviewed and hired the other candidate. And that was really painful. And he didn't even tell me. I found out from the headquarters in France. One of my friends called me and told me. So it was painful, but God taught me that, I had put my career on the throne. He had given me that career to provide stability for me and my daughter, and I had made it an idol. So it was humiliating, but I needed that. I needed that humility.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yep.
that being passed over for that promotion really propelled me to make the career change. And God knew that, I was being resistant, and he knew I needed a big push. So he gave it to me.
It reminds me of, I recently interviewed someone who I greatly respect, David Roth, who's the CEO of Work Matters. And as he talked about his early career hunger and ambition, there was, some similar stories of how God worked to humble him as well. And I understand that. And thank God for that, right? For that grace and mercy in those times when we're in it. It's super painful, but when you look back and you're thankful, he disciplines and chastens those he loves. And
that is so true. It's eye-opening. And I think when we get on a career track, we can kind of put blinders on and we start losing our sense of purpose and why God placed us where we're at. So yeah, it was a big wake-up call for me, for sure.
So you've been doing that now for how long?
A little over 8 years. Yeah, I've been writing full time. So I started a small business called Word Studio, and I mostly write textbooks, but my passion is researching and writing about the Bible and, of course, the intersection between faith and work. And I just signed a contract with Moody Publishers to write my first book, which is Christian Woman's Guide to Leadership.
Congratulations. That's huge.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really, really excited. It's just amazing to me because when God called me to write, I had no idea. I didn't have this set goal to write a book. I didn't know what exactly that was going to look like. So it's interesting because the textbook writing, you're still in the publishing industry. So God took all of that experience and then he used it to help me understand and get into the publishing world and the Christian realm. So just goes to show he doesn't waste anything.
You know what? And I heard you say that on your interview with Catherine Gates, and I love that. That is a really, I think, important thing for us to remember, that God doesn't waste anything that he brings us through, puts us through, allows us to go through and experience the brokenness, the joys, the blessings. And again, it reminds me of another verse that I'll roughly paraphrase, but for those who love him and are called to him, all things work for good, all things, good, bad, indifferent. So, yeah.
Yeah, he recycles and repurposes everything in our life and restores it. And I just love that.
At the end of the podcast, Peggy, we'll talk in detail about how people can contact you and get in touch with you and the resources that you offer. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that would benefit from the work that you're doing and the work that you're going to be doing with your book. So we'll talk more in detail about that. And then I'll also make sure and post links in the podcast notes so that people can get there. So I want to ask a question that's a little bit unique maybe, but you talked about your 7 years at McDonald's, right? And when I was in high school, I went through a program that was for those that were interested in business. And I've had a heart for business since my high school years. I didn't even know until I had a class that I took that was kind of a career preparation. And all of a sudden I found myself doing financials and bookkeeping. And I'm like, in a mock environment. And I'm like, this is super cool. I love this stuff, which is, totally geeky, but you get it because you're an operations supply chain person.
I do.
But I had my instructor, I'll never forget this. My instructor told the class that if anyone had a chance to go work at McDonald's, that they would learn more about good business practices and what I would call now operational excellence, which he didn't use that term back then. But did you find that to be the case in your experience there and you then going into supply chain as a career? Was that a really good learning environment for you at McDonald's?
It was incredibly important to my career later. Everything you just said is 100% true. I think everyone should have to work at McDonald's if they have any interest in business, because you learn about leadership, yes, but you also learn about the importance of timing. The concept of having a weakest link becomes just glaring because, a group of people, and 9 times out of 10, because it's a fast food environment, 50% of them are going to call in and not show up to work. Then you have 3 tour buses come on the lot. You have to be able to plug people into their areas where their strengths can shine so that you can survive the rest of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's also purchasing, all the stuff that goes into making a Big Mac. I mean, there's supply and demand. And as I said, leadership was huge. One of the things that really stood out to me is one of the shift leaders when I first started working there. Anytime things would get hectic on the front line where you see the cashiers and the customers, she would go to the back into the office. And that really stood out to me because if we needed change or we had a question, we needed her to do something for us, she was never around. And it taught me the importance of leaders being present in crisis. That's the time where you show up, and you are front and center and you hit it head on. So I learned so much from that. And like I said, when I worked there, I just thought this is what I'm going to use to get through college. That's it. But it turned into so much more.
That's interesting. I think I've heard that from, like I said, that teacher many years ago. And my son, I think about my oldest son. He worked at McDonald's like a lot of high school kids did. And now he's a business owner. So I've never asked him if he thought what he learned at McDonald's. He helps him to run. He has an automotive repair shop that him and his wife
You should
own,
ask him.
Yeah, I'll have to ask him that. I will. I'm going to ask him now. We'll see each other later today. I'm going to ask him that. So a little different topic or question. Tell us about your family. What's that situation like?
Sure. So my daughter is 34. I can't even believe that as I say it. She still lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. She works in business. She works for a company called DistroKid. They help musicians get their music connected to Spotify, iTunes, that type of thing. She's a musician and she also loves techie things, so it's perfect for her. My husband, George, and I live in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. It is a very small rural mountain town. I joke that, it looks like the North Pole for about 7 months out of the year because we're at 8,000 feet. And he actually grew up in Jackson, Michigan, not far from where you are.
I grew up I think a half hour to 45 minutes south of there. Like Jackson was the town we went to go Christmas shopping. It had a mall. I grew up in a tiny, tiny town. Like my wife and I both actually grew up as the crow flies a mile from each other, but in a little tiny, tiny town. So yeah, Jackson, Michigan. I'm very, very familiar with that.
He grew up there, one of 6 kids. He loved growing up in Jackson. So we're both in our second act careers. He was an industrial engineer first, spent a lot of time working for Toyota and some other big companies. And now he's an artist.
That's a huge change.
Yes. So we both have that. We have that in common. He paints landscapes in oil, and he's very successful. He approaches his art like a business, and that has turned out well for him.
My wife's an art teacher, but she's always been an artist ever since she was little. So yeah, that's cool.
So we met late in life, but we have gone through a lot of changes and adventures together in a really short time. We've made several moves. We both had big career transitions. And most recently, we've been caregivers, which can be very challenging. But that is why we relocated to Pagosa from the city, because we wanted to be closer to his parents. So he's the love of my life.
My wife and I are spending more time now taking care of our moms, her mom and my mom both. They live alone. They're independent still. They're in their 70s though. And yeah, we spend more time. It's kind of that stage of life where we're at as well, where we're making sure we can help them out and our kids help them out. I'm actually going up to my mom's tomorrow for the afternoon to help her with some things at her house. So it's different than raising kids.
It is very different. People I know that haven't done it often compare it to raising kids, but it is very, very different. There's an honor and respect, I think, that you have to be mindful of with decisions and what you say. And It's a tricky process. I'm grateful for God's guidance because there's no way we could do it without him.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. It's not always black and white. Some of the decisions have more, more weight to them, or they're more complex because it's your parents and not your children. So, Peggy, could you tell us about how you came to know the Lord, your faith journey? I've heard it on some podcasts, and it's fascinating to me. And it's always such a blessing to hear how God has worked in someone's life to bring them through ups and downs. And I know he's done that with you, but very interested for you to share that with the audience.
Because my hope is that anyone listening would gain hope from that, would realize that God sees us through every season. So I became a Christ follower against all odds. I say that because I was adopted as a baby into an abusive home where we went to church regularly. Both parents were very involved in church. The house was spotless. So from the outside looking in, we were an ideal family. But on the inside, it was more like a war zone. Looking back, I think they probably had some mental health challenges, which created an unsafe home environment. So they kicked me out when I was 13, and I met my best friend, Karen, the year before. We're still best friends to this day, 44 years later. I know God intentionally brought her into my life when he did, because she was an anchor during a very unstable time for me. So when I left my adoptive parents' home, I bounced around from family to family. The foster system was never involved. There was no government oversight. I finally ended up with Jim and Kathy Brown, and they already had 5 kids. They didn't receive any financial help because the government wasn't involved, but they gave me a home anyway, no questions asked. So I stayed there through high school, and that was one of the happiest times in my life. And it's really the first time that I kind of paused and saw a glimpse of who Jesus really is. Because if you think about it, because of my home environment and the church involvement, it was very confusing for me as a kid. I didn't really understand. Things didn't match up. So when I moved in with the Browns, it's as if God reached down and put me in a place where I could experience hope and love and encouragement, for the first time. And that experience was life-changing for me.
So were they in the same town, or like, how did you go from got kicked out at 13? I can't imagine. I mean, I remember when I was 13, if I would have got kicked out, I would have ended up dead probably. I needed a lot of guidance then. How did you end up
That's a good
transition?
question. This is another big God thing. So we moved from the Chicago area to this little town in North Georgia when I was 12. And I point that out because if my adoptive parents had put me out when we lived in Chicago, I probably wouldn't be talking to you today. So instead, we're in this small town. The first people that I lived with, it was my youth leader. She was a single mom. She had 2 daughters, roughly my age. So I bounced around from family to family, people in the community and in the church. And it was just difficult because those families, there was still kind of this doubt, it was still that era where authority figures like parents were always right. So there was still this kind of lingering doubt about the situation, but there was also a financial implication. I mean, taking in another kid that's 13 years old. So
right.
It was really God's grace, because looking back, when I left the adoptive home, I wasn't scared because I felt like whatever I was going to face on the outside was not going to be as scary as what was going on inside. So I wasn't afraid. But when I look back as an adult, here I am, 13 years old, literally with a garbage bag, going down the road to the church to use the phone.
Yeah, right.
Which was like 5 miles away. There are a lot of bad things that could have happened. So I just feel like God carried me and protected me through that time until I ended up in the safe landing place, the safe landing zone.
So these folks were also within the church?
Yeah,
that you guys
it's really
attended?
interesting because they led a lot of activities for the youth at this small church that I attended. So they were really involved in the church. But there had been a couple of times when they had come to pick me up for activities and they heard what was going on inside the home. So they had a clear understanding that things were not like they should be. And I think that glimpse probably led them to open the door kind of just the right time when I needed it.
Yeah, I think that, so I serve as an elder in our church. And as I'm thinking through that scenario, I think, did the church do what they should have done to try to interject in that situation? And churches should do that. And when they know that, I think in too many cases, and we see this has over the last several years has been uncovered, unfortunately, is that those things are ignored.
Yeah, the church leadership was aware, but they didn't take any action. I think, again, there was this strong feeling of we don't want to get involved. And the adoptive parents did eventually stop going there, but it wasn't because of being confronted by leadership. I would like to hope that things would be different today.
That's part of the structure of the church, the church discipline, church governance, and leadership, that you do get involved in that. If you're a member of a church, that's part of being a member of a church.
Yes,
is the
it is.
accountability. So praise the Lord for that family and them taking you in and helping you to see that is not what God intends for
Yes.
a home.
Yeah, that's true. And even though it made a huge impact on me, my faith journey was still really messy. I'm not one of those people who can say, I was saved on this date in this place. I always believed in God. I just didn't trust him. As a kid, I was like, I don't really remember feeling protected or loved,
Yep.
but God was faithful. He pursued me. He was my constant, and he gradually loved me into a personal relationship with him, which is exactly what I needed. And it was a long, messy process, but I think that's the beauty of grace. God simply would not take no for an answer.
He won't. The perseverance of the saints, right, is one of the doctrines of grace, and he will not let us go. He will pursue us, and thank God for that, because I know there's many times in my life as well that I needed that, especially as a young person. Good. So anything else you'd like to share as far as faith's journey from that point on?
I think for me, it's important not to compare our faith journeys. Comparison is never ends in anything positive anyway. But God, if we look at the Bible, he reached out to and pursued people in different ways, and everybody's journey is going to look differently. So if anyone's listening and they can't name the exact date and time that they accepted Jesus, that doesn't mean that their journey is any less impactful or important to God.
Yeah, I was just recently, again, on a podcast interview with someone who's I consider a personal friend, but she's a school administrator. And she talked about that, and she was blessed to have grown up in a home that was a solid Christian home. And she said, I've just never remembered a time where I didn't love the Lord and, walk with him, certainly imperfectly, but, had that faith. And so praise the Lord for that. But as you said, Peggy, it's different for all of us. And fortunately, our God can handle all those various situations. He is big enough. He is big enough and powerful for that. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I want to kind of pivot our conversation a little bit and talk about leadership. I'd like to know, do you have a leadership motto, principle that you've developed over your career that kind of sums up how you think about leadership? What's the most important thing for you in leadership?
My first business mentor that I mentioned earlier, he told me, always take care of your employees and they will take care of everything else. And that advice stayed with me and definitely became my core leadership principle. And I think we see this throughout Scripture, this idea of taking care of the people we're entrusted with. I mean, God himself provides a powerful example of this, because there's so many times he could accomplish victories and miracles without the help of people. But instead, he mentors and nurtures and raises up leaders and then trusts them to carry out his plans. So I think he provides a great example. And Scripture also tells us repeatedly to put other people first, to be humble and look out for the interests of others before our own. So that is the number one leadership principle that I have tried to follow my entire career.
Yeah. Love God, love others, right? That's what Christ said. That sums up the law and the prophets. Yeah, we're not in that picture.
Right.
It's love God, love others.
As a baby Christian, I always thought that was so easy. I always thought, oh, that's so easy. And, as you know, love is not easy.
No.
It's complicated and it has to be intentional. And we can't do it without God.
No, we can't. I mean, he, as you said, the grace that he's shown us, the forgiveness he's shown us is far greater and deeper than any grace and forgiveness we ever will have to show anyone else. And so that's a constant reminder when I think for me, at least, I'm tempted to not be forgiving or loving towards somebody. It's like, well, God has shown us a great, great love and forgiveness many, many times over. So he expects the same from us. He said that in Scripture. If you don't forgive others, then you're not walking in forgiveness with him. Hey, Peggy, what are your spiritual disciplines? How do you stay close to the Lord? What are the things that you do to maintain your faith and, grow in sanctification?
I start every morning. I get up early and I start every morning with the Lord. And for me, that looks like Bible study and prayer time. I journal my prayers because I'm a person who there's a lot of things going on in my mind. So when I pray, I'm either praying out loud or I'm writing my prayers because that way I know I won't get distracted. But I also love that a journal provides me with a written record of how many times and how big God shows up in my life over and over. And I can go back to that when I need to. So every morning I really work to be consistent in that. I think that's really important. But community is also important. And I have some friends that I get together with remotely, Christian women. But then I also felt led this year to start a Bible study, to lead a Bible study from home. So there's a group of women and myself, and we get together twice a month. When I moved to Pagosa, I felt isolated. I really missed that in-person community. So we get together and study God's word and share prayer requests and share life around a table twice a month. So I love that.
Yeah.
And as far as, I think speaking of community, I think church is really important. And George and I had a church in Colorado Springs, a non-denominational church called Woodman Valley Chapel that was our home church. We loved it. So it was really hard when we moved to Pagosa to find our new home church. So we attend a non-denominational church called Grace in Pagosa most often. We still don't feel settled, and I'm not really sure why that is. We're just kind of an in-between place, I guess. But I do think community, especially in-person community, is really important part of growing as a Christian. So
I can relate to the difficulty in finding a new church. We've been in this area about 13 years. And when we moved here, that was the single hardest thing for us. And at the time, our kids were from elementary to high school. We had 3 kids. And it was super hard for them because our former church had been our social life, really, because they were homeschooled at the time. So, but yeah, that was tough. And I think for years, I would say we didn't feel as settled as we wanted to. And then the Lord eventually led us to a church that we just, have felt like we can just dive in all the way, serve and be a part of, and just felt like it was exactly where we needed to be.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, we ended up being at a church for about 7 years that we served in faithfully, and we were there. We attended about once a year. My wife and I would have that conversation of just that it just didn't feel like it was the right one for us, but we're like, well, we're gonna, we know it's important for us and the kids to be a part of and to serve in the local church, as you said, in that community of believers. And, there were people there that we loved, and there was still something that was a struggle for us. And then eventually, like I said, the Lord led us to a local congregation. We fell in love with the teaching and the pastor and the people, and we're very grateful for that. So I'll be praying that you guys are able to find that as well, because that's tough.
Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that I hope in this podcast is that leaders with all ranges of experience can listen and learn from one another, but I also think about younger leaders and that they might be struggling with things that we, as more experienced leaders, struggled with, and we could hopefully give them some hope in overcoming those things, or that the fact that you might have to struggle with those for a long time, but there's ways to manage it. So if you think about when you were early in your career as a leader, what are some things that you struggled with, and were you able to overcome them, or did you just have to learn to manage them? Talk a little bit about that.
So I am still a recovering perfectionist and workaholic. I confess that. So as a leader early on, both of those traits were out of control. And, I went through a lot of counseling to get over what happened to me in my childhood. And I know that perfectionism and workaholism took root in my childhood. And as time went on, I realized how unhealthy those traits were. And God has really helped me see that when I indulge perfectionism and overwork, I am basically saying I believe the lies from my childhood, and I'm trying to prove something that I don't have to prove. Something else that was eye-opening is I had a friend speak into my life about how I was looking at those traits as things I need to fix and things that just affect me. But she said, those traits negatively impact the people you lead. I mean, they're going to feel like you have these huge expectations. They see you working all those hours. They're going to think, oh, I have to work 60 hours a week to make it in this company, or else I'm not going to be a leader. And so that was eye-opening and a big motivator for me to be mindful and put the work into changing, making some changes. So I've come a long way in both of those areas. A big motivator being what God showed me, but also that I don't want to instill those traits in other leaders that are coming up.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think we have to be mindful. I think there's a fine line between our biggest strength and biggest weakness. If we have a strong work ethic, we might lean into being a workaholic. If we want to work with excellence, we could lean into being a perfectionist. So I think we have to rely, like for me, I have to rely on the Holy Spirit to help me discern where that line is.
I remember one time I was at a company where we had a new CEO, and he spoke about that same thing, work-life balance, and that he wanted to encourage that with his team, with his people, with the company. And, one of the things he's talked about was that he had to learn to not send emails on the weekends and in evenings, because to him, he was like, for me, maybe it's fine for me to do it. It's not interrupting my whatever life. But he goes, at some point, somebody either told him or it dawned on him the fact that when he sent that email to somebody, that person felt they had to respond, right? No matter what was going on. And he's like, and once that thought came to him, he stopped doing that because he didn't want to cause that imbalance, I guess, in other people's lives. So that's a really valid point for leaders to understand that it's not just you and okay, yeah, I can work 60, 70 hours and I like it. And whatever, maybe I don't have a family, or I'm not interrupting things in my life, but you're
sending a message.
You're sending a message. As leaders, you're always sending a message. So I think that's super important to think about. Peggy, when you look at leadership around you in general in the world, and maybe in your spheres of influence, what do you think's a big leadership gap that's had the most negative impact?
There's a gap in specific to the faith community, and I say this because I'm in several professional Christian groups. And one of the gaps I see is that I would love to see leaders advocate for change, even if the change doesn't directly impact them. So for example, and I know Catherine Gates talked about this when she was on your podcast, that, I think men need to care and get involved with the obstacles that women are facing. I think that my generation needs to understand the problems millennials deal with. I think that white professional Christians need to care about the challenges people of color are facing in the workplace. And overall, I think we just need to stop seeing the workplace from inside silos. I think we need to be, have courage and be bold and cut across the silos and help one another. And I see an apathy that kind of frustrates me, where if you can't imagine someone's situation or you haven't experienced it, you're not willing to stand up for that person. And I just think we can't do that. That's just not why God called us into leadership. We have to advocate for others, whether they're exactly like us or not.
That's really insightful. And that goes right back to what we said earlier about loving God and loving others. And that loving others, I think you have to put effort forth in those situations where you may not have grown up in the culture they grew up in. You don't know by default what they're going through, what they have gone through, which means that you have to take time to understand it. You have to spend that time to dig and ask and listen, I think is important.
I agree. I would like to see us close that gap. I think there's a lot of good that could come out of that.
Yeah, that's good. Another question I have for you, just in your work in general, and I think right now the work that you do by default, it is mainly focused on honoring Christ in that work. I mean, that is what you're trying to help others do. But can you tell us a little bit about even before, when you were in the marketplace and the secular leadership role? What are some things you did then to try to honor Christ in your work?
So there's 3 principles I try to follow. And this was the case in corporate, even as a writer today, and as the foundation that I started my ministry to help other Christian leaders. And the first one is to show excellence. I think that there's no room for shoddy work in God's kingdom. Everything we do as Christian leaders is a reflection on Him. So when we work with excellence, we glorify God and we earn the respect from the people we work with. And that creates a foundation for relationships. So show excellence is the first one. And the second one is to broker hope. The pandemic is a great example. As Christian leaders, I think we have a lot of opportunities to steer people through difficult situations in a way that inspires hope. And I think that's really important. And the last one is to love fully. We've been talking about love a lot. And when I first became a manager and then a leader, I read so many books on both topics, and loving your employees wasn't really ever mentioned. I know that it's talked about a little bit now, but God clearly places a high priority on love. So loving the people we work with sets us apart, and it's just simply the right thing to do. So those are the 3 principles I try to follow to honor Christ in whatever I do, but especially in my work.
That's awesome. The first one that you spoke about is, I think if we don't bring as believers a level of excellence to our work, it's a ticket to play the game. I've seen, unfortunately, not a lot of times, I'm glad to say, but unfortunately, I've seen instances where somebody who is an outspoken, bold believer in their workplace, but their work is shoddy, they have a bad attitude. It's just like, I want to tell them, please be quiet about your faith and just focus on your work, because you're doing more harm than good.
We carry the banner. We carry the banner of the kingdom of God, into the workplace, and how we do our work reflects strongly on that banner. So I think that's a big responsibility that we have to take seriously.
And broker hope was the second one. We absolutely should always be someone who brings hope to situations. We talked earlier a little bit about in a state of crisis, and I've worked in some environments that are definitely a state of crisis, and I think it was important to always come and say, hey, we're going to get through this. I'm going to talk about what things can look like and how we can get there. The third topic you mentioned, the third principle, was loving employees. Have you ever heard of or read the book called Love Works by Joel Manby?
I have not.
That is an excellent book. Joel is a believer, an author, obviously, and a former CEO. So Love Works is one that I would encourage people to check out. And it is about that topic specifically. And I remember when I read it, I'd never seen anything like it before that talked about how can we as Christians apply how scriptural love towards those we work with and even those we lead and manage. It's a really good book. It's an easy read. Yeah, I got to meet him, or see him, I guess I should say, at a small event last year here in our community. And I'm a huge fan. So check that out. Yeah, Love Works. So speaking of books, Peggy, who are some of your favorite leadership authors? Who are you following, both authors and then podcasts as well, that the audience might find helpful?
So I read a lot, but I want to highlight a couple of books written by Christian professional women that I know personally. Most Christian leadership books written by women for women are geared toward women who lead in ministry. But the two books I'm recommending are written by Christian women who have corporate or marketplace experience. And I think that's important because there is some crossover between ministry and marketplace, but there are also really big differences. So the first book is The Confidence Cornerstone, A Woman's Guide to Fearless Leadership. So that was written by our mutual friend, Catherine Gates.
That's right.
She was on your podcast in April of this past year. She's the director of Women in the Marketplace, and she has extensive background in corporate leadership. The second book, God's Not Done With You, How to Advance Your Career and Live in Abundance, was written by Mary Jervich, and she is a former COO who coaches women on how to advocate for themselves and how to develop as leaders. So what I love about these books is they're both biblical and very practical. And they're written by women who understand firsthand the challenges that Christian women face in the workplace. So I can't recommend those enough.
We'll link to those again. Yeah, I'll hyperlink to those on. I'm sure you can find them. I know you can find the one on Amazon, probably both, but I'll link to those in the show notes.
Both on Amazon. There's also a couple of podcasts. We were talking a little bit before we started about kind of this movement of being purposeful with faith and work and that intersection. And there's some podcasts specifically for Christian women. And one of them, Catherine's organization, Women in the Marketplace, just started a new podcast. There's a group called She Works for Him that has a podcast also. So I really recommend both of those, specifically for Christian professional women.
Great resources for sure. Actually, and you were on the She Works for Him podcast, I believe. I listened to you on that one. Catherine Gates and her colleagues are doing a lot of really good work to help women in the marketplace for sure. So what advice, Peggy, would you give to and I'm sure you do, this is part of your ministry, and we'll talk a little bit more about this before we wrap up, but what advice would you give to a first-time leader, let's say a young lady who's been given her first role as a manager or leader? What advice would you give out?
So a lot of the women that I've mentored over the years through corporate and through my foundation struggle with conflict and addressing that as a new leader. So there's a quote by Max Lucado that I love, and he says, conflict is inevitable, but combat isn't.
That's good.
So I tell new leaders, conflict is normal, and their natural tendency is going to be to want to procrastinate dealing with it because it's not pleasant. But the little problems we ignore today grow into big disruptions tomorrow. So I always tell new leaders, address conflict head on. It's going to be something that you're going to deal with inevitably, but the longer a situation is unaddressed, the bigger it's going to grow. So I wish somebody would have told me that, that it is normal, and that the quicker you deal with it, the better it's going to be for everyone involved, including you.
Yeah, I could go on and say a lot about that. I have one of the mentors that I interviewed. I don't remember when I interviewed him. Grant Blair's his name, and he works in finance for Operation Mobilization, which is a missions agency. He's been doing this for a long time, and he shared with me on the podcast that that's something he's always struggled with, was dealing with conflict. But he said the motivator for me is that I didn't deal with it quickly enough earlier in my career, and I learned how bad it can get. It's only going to get worse if you don't deal with it early on. So absolutely wise advice. I want to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now and how you are helping women in the marketplace, and how they can reach you and contact you, and what resources you have. I know you have a great website, but let's talk about that so people know how to get in touch with you and know how to tap into all the work you're doing.
Sure. So we were talking about how God doesn't waste anything. And I knew when I left corporate that he wouldn't want me to waste the decades of business experience he had given me. So I started a foundation called Sacred Work. And through the foundation, I provide free leadership and career coaching for Christian women. And I like to say that I will help anyone. I also help men. I help people who aren't believers. It doesn't matter to me, but I like them to know about my faith up front. It's my anchor. It's who I am. So I love doing that. And because my work schedule is flexible, I'm able to fit that ministry in. So if there's anyone listening who would like help in changing careers or dealing with conflict in the workplace, they can contact me through my website, peggybodde.com. I would also love it if they'd connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a private group for Christian professional women called Sacred Work on LinkedIn. So they can contact me in either of those places. And if there's any way I could serve any of your listeners, I'd be happy to do that.
Well, that's great. I remember hearing you say in another podcast, you had that private group on LinkedIn. And so that's pretty cool. I didn't realize that was even a thing that you could do. And so if someone goes to your website, they'll also be able to subscribe. I think you have a blog that they can subscribe to, right? And read some of your writings.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that. I have a newsletter, the Sacred Work newsletter. It comes out twice a month, and it covers topics like conflict and change management, all the things that leaders face. So if they subscribe, then they'll get the newsletter twice a month.
And I'm sure that when your book publishes, that would be the best place to stay in touch and be able to be aware and informed of when that comes out.
Yes, I am very excited. The publishing process is long. It won't come out till early 2024. But yeah, I would love it if they would subscribe and they could stay in touch, and I could help them if they need it.
Well, very good. Before we wrap up, Peggy, I will have one last question I always ask people that I interview, and that is, when you are led to retire, whenever that is, when the Lord leads you to be done with the professional work, what do you hope that you'll have left as a legacy and the impact that you'll have had on people?
My hope is that I would have loved well. I think that the biggest, best impact we can have on people and for God's kingdom is it all starts with love.
It does. Again, it goes back to what the Lord said, right? Love God and love others. And that is something that I think we always have to be challenging ourselves with, because it's not easy. We're not lovable many times, unfortunately. So we need God's help in that. Well, hey, Peggy, again, I appreciate you being on today. I've really enjoyed getting to know you and celebrate what God has done through your life and what he's doing now. And I hope that we have listeners that can reach out to you and be helped and connect with you and be a blessing to you, and that you can help them as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you,
today.
Jason. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm grateful for your podcast.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for joining our podcast today. I pray that you are inspired by Peggy's story and by what God has done in her and through her. Be sure to check out her website and connect with her on LinkedIn. Lord willing, we will be back here again next month to meet another leader striving to honor Christ and her word. God bless, and see you in season 2.